Hello and welcome to SlimDevOps episode 5. We've got a couple of special guests with us this evening, Peter. What are we going to be covering?
Yeah, hi everybody. Pretty excited today. We have Priceline's Marty Brodbeck, CTO, with us, and our CEO, John Amaral. They're going to be talking about tech and travel, things very near and dear to my heart as a former TripAdvisor PM here. So pretty excited about that. And yeah, just before we get going, I see Eric in the chat there. Just want to say thanks to Eric for last time. That was such a great episode where we slimmed the R container and really appreciated his insights there, and pretty kind to me as a Python programmer. The R community was pretty nice about that. So I was excited to see that, but cool. Yeah, so we've got a couple things going on the Slim.AI site before we get started. Are we going to jump into that, Martin?
Sure. The first piece we have is an article about Docker containers for your Raspberry Pi.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm not sure how many people are jumping over from DockerCon. It's pretty fun over there, but a lot of talk about the new ARM architecture over there and what's going on with Raspberry Pi. So we have an article up for those Raspberry Pi enthusiasts out there who want to give that a try. Obviously, when you're working with a Raspberry Pi, image size is a really big concern, and so using tools like Docker Slim and the tools that we're building at Slim.AI are really going to help you out with that. So go ahead over and check that out. I'm excited about that article. Give us your thoughts on Twitter.
Yeah, that article plus what's been announced at DockerCon today has been inspiration for an idea which we'll be talking about in the coming weeks, I think. I've got some cool ideas building up around that.
Yeah, Martin's excited about that. Martin told me he has 23 Raspberry Pis at his house. So
27.
27. Okay, there's more now.
Don't sell him short. Don't sell him short.
Cool. Right. And we also had a piece on serverless applications for Docker.
Yeah, we've been getting a lot of questions since we started doing this around AWS Fargate. There's a lot of people who are sort of making the migration over to that. So it's a little bit of a primer article on sort of how Docker integrates into a serverless architecture. A lot of people talking about serverless. So a little bit of a primer, a little bit about some of the platforms that are out there that can do that for you. And of course, if you have, build time is a really critical thing when it comes to serverless applications in your cloud bill. So this article goes into that and explores that a little bit. So.
And we alluded to it. If you're not aware, DockerCon 21 is happening today and tomorrow. So if you're into containers and all of that good stuff, which you probably are if you're here, then you should head over there. After this, they're on a break at the moment. And go and pick up the rest of the schedule that they're working through over the coming days.
Cool. Okay, well, great. We can turn it over to John and Marty to introduce themselves and start with the Q&A. So,
hey, folks. Welcome. I'm John. I'm CEO of Slim.AI. Marty
Brodbeck, CTO at Priceline. It's a pleasure to be here, John. So thanks for having me.
Same, man. So happy to have you with us. I think I just want to do a little bit of a thank you, a formal thank you for having you on today. Marty's a good friend, also an esteemed technologist who's been a great innovator and visionary technologist at a lot of the household name companies we all know. As he just mentioned, he's CTO at Priceline.com. Happy to see the travel biz back up and running, and probably good times ahead. And but he's also been at places like Shutterstock and Pearson and Pfizer and Merrill Lynch, senior technologist roles in those companies, CTO level kind of stuff. And he's been behind building some of the I think largest and most successful apps in the various domains he's been in. So thrilled to have you.
It's great to be here. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. If you don't mind, would you give us like a little bit more about your background and tell us, maybe a little about your role and what kinds of, big things you've been working on?
Yeah. So I started, the funny thing is I was never going to get into technology, and here I am 25 years later. I was going to be a lobbyist. So, my mom still scratches her head. But
thanks for joining the dark side.
Yeah, it's been great. It's been great. So I've had a chance to work in, financial services, pharmaceuticals, consumer products. Worked at Diageo for a long time. Pearson, Shutterstock, and Amaral Priceline. So it's been each one of those companies has been just an interesting challenge for me, and I've really enjoyed working with a lot of people there. And I'll date myself, but I worked on my very first cloud project back in 2007 when I was at Pfizer, and we were trying to figure out how to store clinical data in a much more efficient and cost-effective way. And a startup company called Amazon Web Services, and they had a novel idea in which we could start storing our data in a much more effective way. So go figure, and here we are in 2021, almost 14 years later, and the world has completely changed, but some things stay the same. So at Priceline, I've been fortunate to work at just a fantastic company, and when our strategy really from a technology perspective has really been a couple key things that we've been working on. The first is really how do we drive future strategic business growth by making our applications and our platforms much more resilient and scalable. So in thinking through that strategy, we started developing a plan to modernize all of our applications into a 12-factor architecture running on containers and running on GKE. So by the end of this year, we'll roughly have 80% of our entire product platform running in Google Cloud on containers and on Kubernetes at scale. And the tricky part about this has been, it's not been a lift and shift, because I've been through that. And the problem with lift and shift is you're just moving the garbage from one pile to another. So we've been fortunate enough, and I've learned the hard way, that in order to do cloud native projects or these modernization things the right way, you really got to start with the application. So we've been working on that. The second big thing has been developer productivity, and how do you move much more of the day in, day out activities into the developers' hands to make them more productive, because the law of economics suggests that you'll never have enough DevOps people, you'll never have enough SRE people to keep up with what developers are doing. So how do you shift left all of the responsibilities that would typically fall into the hands of infrastructure folks into the hands of developers, where infrastructure really becomes an enabler for them. And the last big thing we've been working on is a complete transformation of our data platform into a customer first platform where we can stream data in real time. We understand what our customers are doing on our platform, and we can in real time personalize, recommend our products to our customers. So those are like the big macro things we've been working on here
Exciting
so far
stuff.
since I've been here at Priceline. Yeah.
Cool, man. All big things as usual. You're working on big important stuff, and that scale. You mentioned the transitions that have happened throughout your career. You said, I saw this S3 thing, and you were there when Amazon took over, and you've watched a whole bunch of technology shifts and been able to use them as you've transformed and built capabilities. And I'd imagine Priceline's applications, have to perform really fast. You have to deliver new features fast. All these things is a highly competitive space. You mentioned developer productivity and all of that, and what goes along with is lots of tooling in it. How have you been thinking about that? How to get developers to move their software from their desktops to the cloud, and what part is containerization and the shifts towards cloud native tools? What impact has that had on you? How's it benefited you, and what have been some of the key challenges?
Yeah. Well, I think developer productivity is really easy in a startup, because you can have one of your employees do it, and he's responsible for
Right.
making developer productivity happen for a group of 10 people. When you're in organizations of 500, 1,000 plus engineers, it gets a little bit more difficult. And containers are basically eating the world at this point, at least within the last two companies I've been. What I mean by that is the whole notion of a container is to drive more productivity for developers, meaning that I can develop a feature, have it completely isolated, and have no dependencies upon other pieces of my infrastructure to design, develop, and deploy it. But in doing that, you basically have to buy into the fact that I am going to shift a lot of the major responsibilities for the design and development of software into the hands of developers. And that means embracing this notion of developer first mentality, which is, what do I need to ensure that my developers have in their hands or in their toolbox to make them the most effective. And then when you apply the factor of COVID on top of that, it really gets magnified, where you have a distributed workforce across 5 to 6 different offices globally. How do you make sure that they're being the most efficient and effective?
Yeah. I imagine those developers have had to learn a lot of new stuff, right, to be able to take part in these new development, workflows,
Yeah.
right? Just introducing containers into the world, and Kubernetes becoming the cloud native operating system, and all the other tech you have, including all the pieces you need to build. Like, how have your developers been able to keep up with that? What kind of challenges do they face in just knowing how to work with all these different things?
I think at first, if you just start with take containers aside, if you first start with the architecture around 12 factor. So, what does 12 factor really mean in practical usage? It's one thing to, you read a book and you think, oh yeah, I'm going to design all my applications to be 12 factor, but how do you actually embed it into your organization so that every developer understands what it means to develop and design 12 factor applications? And it took a lot of training of our developers to think about that. So we dipped our toe in the water first, where we were targeting 1 or 2 groups to move to this 12 factor mentality. And then, 12 factor, you then apply all the great principles around containers to that, and stitching those 2 things together really made us look at how we should be modernizing our CI/CD pipeline to embrace those concepts. So, the introduction of not only new architecture practices, but this notion of having a mono repo at the center of how all of our developers will work together, and then introducing technologies, open source technologies like Rush, to understand the interdependence between different projects. So if I am developing this new microservice, who are the other projects within my mono repo that are depending on that? And then when you get into the build cycle, it's then, how do I package up this business function into a container that then can be deployed seamlessly into production? And then you start off with one team around that, and then you times it by 10, and then you start getting into a different class of problem.
Yeah, I hear, in talking to folks, that do what you do for a living, they often tell me that, there are bottlenecks that kind of crop up as you think about these architectures, especially in software delivery. Have you seen that sort of thing happening? Like, what have you done to abate it? It seems like there's always a place where, you're chasing the next slowest part of the system. What's been happening with you in that regard as you've transformed?
Yeah, I think so once you get into, we've tackled it step by step, to be honest with you, because trying to boil the ocean and say, I'm going to take my entire CI/CD pipeline and modernize it at the same time, right, would drive complete chaos into the organization. So we've been pretty deliberate about the changes we've made. We first started off with knowing that we needed to have a mono repo type of architecture to facilitate sharing of code. So that was very important. So we started with that. Then we understood, the need for having a very modern build architecture. So we made a transition to, GitHub Actions. And then it was a whole piece around how do we automate the build of infrastructure and our GKE environment, and how we, script those. So we moved a lot of our scripting to Terraform. And then we wanted to, create a very declarative way to facilitate continuous deployment. So how do we do a canary deploy? How do we roll back the canary deploy, et cetera? So that's where we've introduced technologies like Harness to really facilitate the continuous, deployment model that we wanted in our applications. And then we didn't do all those things at the same time. We kind of chunked them out step by step. And then in parallel, educating and training the organization on 12-factor development.
That's awesome. Any one of those changes is like a massive change, right? Like as you think about, the way you led that change in the organization, the way the organization had to, what it had to do to be able to adopt those sequential, incremental changes. Like, what do you think your secret sauce is, and what would you tell any other tech leader like yourself how to take that on?
Well, I think, for us, the way I view it is that, if you look at like your, financial process, like your order to cash process or your pay to procure process in any one of these companies, people view those as the most mission critical process. And there's a lot of investment that goes into optimizing those. But what's now starting to happen is like the software development process for many companies is the single most important business process that they have in the company. And in doing so, you almost have to take a Lean Six Sigma approach to it. In other words, what are the bottlenecks that are basically causing my developers to not deliver features and functions in a timely manner? And that's the way we looked at it. When I worked at Pfizer, we were big on Lean Six Sigma. We would look at our manufacturing process and find out what the bottlenecks were. We applied the same thing to software development. We looked at where are developers getting tied up in our process and where can we make them, most efficient. So like, for instance, we would deploy our code to 100% of the environment, and we would find out within like 10, 20, 30, 40 minutes where we had an issue that we were impacting customers, and that had real revenue impact. So we focused on, well, why don't we introduce canary deploys to allow our developers to go faster, but minimize the error rate that we would have with our customers. And so that was one, Lean Six Sigma practice that we applied to our software development process. We wanted to make sure that we, enabled sharing more effectively. So I developed one component. Why don't I develop that React component and make sure everyone can share it? So that's where you introduced, a mono repo. So we kind of like looked at it in a manufacturing kind of way and figured out, what are the best things that we can do to make developers more productive, because we get measured from an engineering perspective on metric around how does this feature drive higher conversion rate on our website. And so it's very important. Like, we're a very A/B testing kind of culture, so the more tests, the more features we can develop, the higher measurement we can look at that conversion rate. So features, cool. driving out features is very important for us.
Yeah, it's the can't fix what you don't measure. So a lot of those principles of being very deliberate about how you judge success is a very important thing to do, even in software development. Go figure. If you mentioned a sequence of transformations you've done in your development environments and across your software delivery pipeline. So what's the next thing? What's the next kind of either technology or innovations you think are going to help folks like you go faster, better, stronger? Like, where do you look next?
I think one of the big things that we haven't figured out yet is, and I was talking about this before, is like, so basically containers are now eating the world. And what I mean by that is that you have all of these autonomous units of work running in your environment. And so you're able to really iterate on those and develop on those, but you don't, from a monitoring and infrastructure perspective, you don't know what's running inside of those things. It's kind of like, there's a black box of goodness running in your environment, yet you don't have a real good sense or inventory of what's running inside of those things. And then you compound that, we have development teams all over, the world. How do you standardize a version of a container for a developer? Like, so our front end team would have a standard container that they would operate on with, the appropriate software and versioning, and it was their container that they worked off of. And then our backend engineers had the same thing. So container management and understanding how those things are operating in your environment and the interdependencies between them is a problem that will start emerging once we get our entire product platform into Kubernetes over the next year, and then effectively monitoring and maintaining those. And as software becomes more of a remote practice, enforcing container standardization at the design level will become even more important for your development teams to be productive.
Yeah, it's sort of software best practices consistency across the board, but in the form, but since software is containers, there's a unit of software there that has to be maintained and managed. Also hear people talking about, the next step. You've got a container, which is a part of an app. It's a component of a service, perhaps, but it takes several of them to make something useful. Often, as to compose a service. Have you, and going to the next step on that question? It's how do you keep track of all the, how those things are supposed to work together? How do you keep track of, how does someone who's building, say, 1,000 different microservices from 5,000 different containers, how do you keep track of all that? It seems like what I've observed is there's a lot of hand stitching knowledge in people's heads. It seems to be part of the next phase of that same problem you just described.
Yeah. So, traditionally, how people have done it, quite honestly, is that you would take your, an APM tool, and it would give you a view into the how those things interoperate together, or you would have or create an artifact that would define the architecture. But as you know, those things, a document is static, it changes, or people can leave the organization, and the APM will give you, or trigger off an event when CPU or memory or something's not working.
Right.
But those tools don't really, lay out the interdependency at a physical level on how containers are dependent upon one another. So I'll give you a great example, like a checkout flow. A checkout flow where a customer puts an item into a cart. That card is then cataloged for all its products. Those products are then priced, and then you basically trigger off a payment event using, a credit card or an alternative payment. That could be 8 to 15 containers that make up that flow, right? But there's no tooling yet today that basically instruments that in a way to understand within your Kubernetes cluster the interdependency between those things, how they should be versioned, how they've been updated, and how they should be managed. All the physical monitoring that happens today is really at the Kubernetes level, but not physically at the container level, which, it's the age-old problem where the bug gets into production, and then you have to go back all the way to design to figure out where that issue was. It would be nice if you understood that problem at the design level and could iterate the testing of it before it got into production.
For sure.
So,
yeah. So more, you mentioned earlier that your engineers, development engineers, software developers are taking part in this sort of bigger picture of getting code from their laptops to be able to work in production. Are you seeing them start to have to engage in defining some of the artifacts that help it get to the end state of deploy? Like, for instance, are they authoring more Helm charts, or authoring more really describing how these things fit together? Is that becoming something that's creeping further and further left in your organization?
Yeah, so the one thing that we've really struggled with is figuring out auto scaling effectively, like HPA at scale, and having that capability be more of a, well, can we define that at design time and figure out how these things should auto scale together would be wonderful. The feedback around Helm that I got in my last company, it's just very difficult to work with for some developers. If there was a declarative way to kind of figure out auto scaling for containers at the design time level, and just iterate it all the way to the time you get into production, that would be a huge, I think, productivity gain. Because a lot of times you try to figure out these things and how they're supposed to auto scale in the run cycle of what you do. And the reality is when you're building out these applications, it's better to think through those problems at design time.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting that, you have teams of people that are building your infrastructure. You have teams of people that are building the apps that run on the infrastructure, but there's always that little gray area in between where, you have to translate ideas about how this app will run best to folks that know how the infrastructure will work best. And there's like a fitting problem there, right? Do you see that happening in that sort of interface between those teams?
All the time. I think the hardest thing is scaling Kubernetes, and the thing inside Kubernetes are containers. You run into memory leaks or it not running effectively, and we haven't figured out, from my view anyway, how to figure out those problems. And that problem I'm defining the interaction between Kubernetes and containers at a design level, like to simulate how they should be running. It's to the point where you design your container, you build your code, you get it, and then you put it into Kubernetes, and then all of a sudden you find out all these issues that you're having with it. It would be great to force those problems or interact and deal with those problems in the design time arena. Because when you're in production and it's running already, and then you're trying to diagnose the problem, it's very difficult to go back to the root cause of it. You basically have to re-engineer everything all over again.
Right. It could come down to architecture issues. It could come down to interaction issues. It's a lot of complexity there. How are you facilitating testing in the sort of at the developer level? Like what is their experience? How are I imagine the Priceline deployments are pretty complex. There's lots of stuff going on there. As a developer, how do you actually kind of test your stuff?
Yeah, so we have a function within our organization called SDATs, which are software developers in test. And so what they do is they work very closely with the developers on designing functional tests for their code within a particular area. And then that test runs through a build cycle, and then we have in our pipeline in Harness automated testing for smoke integration, quality, security, et cetera. So those are automated gates. We just recently introduced this notion of a pre-prod Kubernetes environment that allows us to simulate a lot of what we are doing in Kubernetes, because we saw through our first turn of the wheel all the issues that can happen when you don't appropriately test these things in a pre-prod environment. So we've done we made a significant investment in standing up an automated pre-prod environment so that developers can more seamlessly start testing their containers in a live, real to production environment before it goes into prod to catch some of these issues or bugs.
Yeah, it's pretty important stuff, because the separation in lots of organizations between where things run finally and where things run locally can be pretty wide. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks again for sharing all the insight. Like, if you had parting advice for someone who was trying to do what you do and innovate in this space, like, how did you learn how to do all this stuff? Like, what's the kind of most important thing you've learned along the way that helps you every day do your job?
I think failing fast. I mean, in doing these things, I've had my share of failures, and I think failing fast is one of the big lessons that I've learned. Because with a lot of these things, it's really trial and error. You don't know how it's going to work, but it's the right thing to do, and you may get frustrated by it, or culturally your organization, it may or may not be ready for it. But I've learned, failing fast too. I think the other big thing is to really, my job in some ways is to be, is to listen to what my developers are telling us as an organization, and make sure that we're creating or unblocking roadblocks for them to be more productive. And taking a very customer-centric approach to developer productivity has been something that we've really focused on. And what I've learned in the past is by not focusing on it, you can basically disenfranchise an entire engineering organization by not listening to them, which is not a good place to be in.
Well, amen to that. I mean, developers are driving the modern economy, and we need to support them every way we can, because that's how businesses grow today. That's how the world goes around today. So thanks again for all your insight and being so open to sharing with us. I mean, we're really psyched to have you on. Tons of good knowledge there, and thanks again.
Yeah,
thanks
very much. We've got some feedback in the live chat. We're joined by Eric, who we alluded to earlier, who's a member of our community and an early adopter of Docker Slim in the R community, and he's a prominent data scientist and R advocate. And he was asking, with all that data, what AI ML are you using within your infrastructure?
Yeah, we're basically we use our data streaming architecture is we capture all of our customer events through Kafka, and we're introducing a new framework from a company called RudderStack that allows us to collect user patterns on your website. All of that data is streamed into Kafka. And then from Kafka, we put it into our data lake, which runs on Cloud SQL from Google. And then we run TensorFlow on top of that to basically operationalize a lot of our ML models. And we're also introducing new technology from a company called Valohai that gives you a lot of machine learning operations, like similar to DevOps. And we basically roll and run our ML models that way through that infrastructure.
Thank you for that detail. Hopefully that's food for thought there, Eric. And also, Eric sympathized with your point about documenting architecture that spans multiple services. That's pain that he feels as well.
Okay. Well, really cool, Marty. It was cool to hear that. My TripAdvisor was fairly similar, and it's just the volume that comes through sites like Priceline and TripAdvisor, and how you keep all of these things going when you have that kind of scale and that many transactions happening. And I'm sure with the world opening back up, you guys will be, seeing what all new cool stuff you guys built and how that holds up with all the new volume. So it'll be an interesting time for you. So super cool. Thank you for coming on with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much for coming. If you want to hear more of what Marty has to say or get in touch, you'll find his Twitter profile on screen here. So he's at Marty Brodbeck on Twitter. Thank you very much for your time today. That was a fascinating interview. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And if you're not subscribed to this channel, please subscribe. And you also want to, above my head is the Slim.AI URL. At the bottom of that page, you'll find all of our social places, including our Discord. If you want to interact with us and ask questions, feel free to do so. And our YouTube channel, where we're uploading a backlog of these live episodes so that you can catch up with those and pull out the pearls of wisdom that are held within. And I think that's it. Unless anyone else has got any closing words, I think we may be done.
Thanks again, Marty. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My pleasure. And if you ever want to talk about developer productivity, I can spend hours on it. Yeah. So let me know.
That's all we talk about. So yeah,
that's what we care about.
So,
cool.
Yeah, we'll consider that an offer for a re-invitation at some future date,
Yes.
which we'll take you up on. Right. Well, thanks very much, everyone. And with that, we'll wrap it up there, and we'll see you in the next one. Keep an eye on the schedule to see when we're going live next and what the topic is going to be.
Bye,
Thanks
everyone.
very much, everyone. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.